philosophical work that Rudolf Steiner presented to the world in 1894 when he was 33 did not simply propose yet another theory about the nature of human freedom to add to countless theories that philosophers had debated over millennia, but offered something radically new, a verifiable path through which anyone willing to carefully examine his own experience of thinking and acting could discover for himself that freedom is neither a consoling illusion nor a transcendent mystery, but an observable fact of consciousness that reveals itself when we observe with sufficient precision as knowledge really works and how genuine moral decisions actually happen. The methodological strategy that permeates the philosophy of freedom from beginning to end is revolutionary in its simplicity and rigor. Rather than constructing elaborate arguments based on debatable metaphysical premises or appealing to the authority of religious or philosophical tradition, Steiner simply invites the reader to look directly at one's own conscious experience without presuppositions and honestly describe what he actually finds there, trusting that careful observation will reveal structures that abstract argumentation can indicate but cannot replace. This phenomenological approach that Steiner employs decades before phenomenology became an established philosophical movement through Husserl transforms the question of freedom from a theoretical problem to be solved by logic to a practical discovery to be made through rigorous self-observation. It is not a question of whether freedom exists in some abstract metaphysical sense, but of whether we can find freedom operating in our own lived experience of knowing and acting, and if so, precisely, where and how it manifests itself. The original German title, Die Philosophie der Freiheit, carries intentional ambiguity between philosophy of freedom, as theoretical investigation of concept of freedom, and philosophy of freedom, as philosophy that is itself free and that leads practitioner to freedom. Steiner is simultaneously making philosophical analysis of possibility of freedom and offering free thinking practice that realizes freedom through the very act of following arguments. The fundamental division that Steiner establishes at the outset between perception and concept as two complementary components of all cognitive experience provides the foundation for every subsequent argument about the nature of knowledge and freedom. When we carefully observe any act of knowledge, looking at a tree, listening to music, remembering a past event, understanding a mathematical proposition, we invariably discover that experience consists of two elements that seem to come from different directions, and that must be brought together to constitute complete knowledge. On the one hand, there is perception, or what is simply given to consciousness without our choice, sensory impressions of colors, shapes, sounds, textures that appear when sensory organs are exposed to appropriate stimuli, or internal states of feeling and impulse that arise spontaneously without conscious decision to have them. These aspects of experience simply happen to us. They come to us outside of conscious control. They are received passively. On the other hand, there's a concept, or what is actively produced by thinking consciousness through its own effort. The idea of a tree that allows us to recognize a common pattern in multiple individual perceptions. The concept of melody that organizes a succession of sounds into a meaningful unit. An understanding of a logical relationship that connects premises to a conclusion in an argument. These concepts are not ready-made data in perception, but must be brought about by thinking activity that requires attention and work. The difference between passive reception of perceptions and active production of concepts is directly observable to anyone who pays attention to how knowledge actually works. No one can decide to see red when they are looking at green, but everyone can decide to think about mathematics instead of history. Everyone can choose to focus thought on a specific problem or let it wander. This distinction between passivity of perception and activity of thought is crucial to Steiner's argument because it is precisely in the activity of thinking that freedom has its root and foundation. We are passive in relation to perceptions that simply happen to us, but we are active in relation to thoughts that we produce through our own efforts. The deep philosophical problem that Steiner identifies in traditional views of knowledge is that both naive realism and subjective idealism fail to recognize that perception and concept are not two separate realities, but are two aspects of a single reality that the process of knowing temporarily separates and that must consciously bring together. Naive realism assumes that sensory perceptions give us direct access to real objects that exist independently in the external world, and that concepts are merely passive mental copies of these objects, formed automatically when objects affect sensory organs. This view seems obvious to common sense, but collapses under analysis because if concepts were passive copies of external objects, we would have no criteria to distinguish faithful from distorted copies, since we never have direct access to external originals, but only to supposed mental copies. It is like trying to check whether a mirror reflects faithfully without ever looking at objects directly, but only reflections. Berkeley's subjective idealism offers the opposite solution, stating that only mental ideas are real, while the supposed external material world is an illusion or mental construct. This position avoids realism problems, but creates equally serious ones because it makes it impossible to explain why perceptions have a regular order independent of will, and why multiple people perceive the same objective world. Steiner's solution transcends both positions through the recognition that perception and concept are neither representation and original, nor appearance and reality, but are two complementary halves of a single reality that experience artificially separates. Red rose that I see is not external object represented in mind, nor illusion created by mind, but it is reality that perception presents me only partially as private sensory impression, while thought reveals rest to me through universal concept. Real, complete object is unity of particular perception and universal concept brought together through cognitive activity of thinking that synthesizes what experience divided. Steiner's extraordinarily deep analysis of the act of thinking about oneself as a unique activity that is simultaneously observable and performed by the same consciousness reveals a paradoxical structure that does not fit into traditional philosophical categories. In all other cases of knowledge, there is a clear separation between the act of knowing and the known object. When I know tree, consciousness that knows is distinct from tree that is known. When I know feeling of joy, consciousness that observes feeling is distinct from the observed feeling itself. But when I know the act of thinking, an amazing thing happens. Consciousness that knows and thought that is known are identical because thinking is the activity of the same consciousness that is trying to know it. This creates a unique situation where the object of knowledge is not something external that must be represented in consciousness, but is the activity of consciousness itself becoming transparent to itself. Steiner argues that this self-transparency of thinking is key to understanding the possibility of genuine knowledge, because here we finally have a case where there's no gap between knower and known that could generate skepticism about correspondence between mental representation and external reality. When I think about thinking, my thought is not representing something other than itself, but is directly apprehending its own activity without mediation that could distort. This capacity for thinking to apprehend itself directly without intermediary is what Steiner calls intuition in the specific technical sense, not vague hunch nor mystical feeling, but direct intellectual vision of ideal content through active participation in it. When I intuit mathematical truth, I'm not passively receiving information from an external source nor arbitrarily inventing fiction, but I'm actively participating in an objective logical structure that exists independently but becomes conscious only through my effort to think. The crucial transition from epistemology to ethics that takes place in the second half of the book develops a parallel argument applied to the domain of action rather than knowledge, just as thought is free when based on intuition of concepts rather than causal determination. So action is free when based on moral intuition of values rather than natural impulses or external commands. Steiner identifies a continuous spectrum of possible motivations for human action, from complete determination by biological instincts to complete freedom through ethical individualism. At the lower end, we find purely instinctual drives. Hunger, driving the search for food. Thirst, driving the search for water. Fear, driving the escape from danger, where there is no genuine choice because the organism simply executes biological programming automatically. One level higher, we find desires and preferences acquired through social conditioning and personal experience that, although not biologically innate, are still determined by external factors that the person has internalized without conscious critical examination. Intermediate level is occupied by actions based on feelings and emotions that, although more refined than raw instincts, are still passive, because they simply happen to us without us choosing to have them. Even higher is the level of OB-based action adherence to external moral norms, religious commandments, social laws, universal ethical imperatives, such as the Golden Rule or Kant's categorical imperative, where there is an element of reason and universality, but still not genuine freedom because the person is following external authority rather than self-determining. Only at the highest level of individual moral intuition do we find authentic freedom, where a person acts based on direct perception of the unique value of a particular situation without the mediation of general rules or external pressures. This moral intuition is not arbitrary subjective feeling, but is a thoughtful apprehension of ethical imperative that emerges from complete understanding of unique context, including needs of everyone involved, likely consequences, conflicting values that require balancing. The revolutionary concept of moral imagination that Steiner introduces as a necessary complement of moral intuition represents the creative ability to devise new and unique ways of realizing perceived values in specific circumstances, rather than merely applying ready-made solutions repeatedly. Just as a genuine artist does not follow formulas but creates original works through imaginative vision, informed by technical mastery, so a morally free person does not follow recipes but creates unique moral actions through ethical intuition informed by a deep understanding of human nature and practical possibilities. This analogy between morality and art that Steiner develops is profound and reveals much about what he understands by freedom. It is not the ability to do anything arbitrarily without restrictions, but it is the ability to act creatively in response to the perceived needs of a situation, just as an artist is free not to paint anything randomly but to express authentic vision through mastery of the medium. Freedom requires both insight into what should be done and the ability to do it. A person may have deep moral intuitions, but if he lacks the imagination to devise how to implement them or the willpower to execute plans, the intuitions remain sterile. Full development of moral freedom requires integrated cultivation of all these capacities, refinement of moral perception through attention to nuances of human situations, expansion of imagination through exposure to multiple possibilities, strengthening of will through practice of executing conscious decisions even against resistance. The devastating critique that Steiner directs against moralities based on external authority is not a rejection of all value of moral guidance, but is an insistence that external obedience must eventually be transcended through conscious internalization if a person is to achieve genuine freedom. For a child who lacks self-judgment, obedience to rules imposed by parents is appropriate because it provides external structure that replaces internal structure that has not yet been developed. For a society of morally immature people, laws that specify behavior require minimum order. But for an adult who has developed the ability to think morally for himself, continuing to merely obey rules without understanding reasons or evaluating applicability to specific situations is an abdication of responsibility and remaining a minority. Steiner radically distinguishes between obeying command because external authority imposes it under threat of punishment and following principle, because one's own conscience recognizes validity through understanding. First is heteronomy that keeps a person in infantile dependence. Second is autonomy that expresses moral maturity. The difference is not necessarily in external behavior because both obedience and self-determination can produce the same action, but in internal motivation and relationship to principle, obeying out of fear versus acting out of insight. Steiner can thus assert that the Ten Commandments or categorical imperative contain genuine wisdom, but that value can only be authentically appropriated when one independently rethinks principles, until one fully understands reasons and accepts them as valid based on one's own judgment rather than external authority. The brilliant reconciliation that Steiner achieves between freedom and necessity through the concept of rational self-determination dissolves the seemingly insurmountable dichotomy that philosophers have faced for centuries. Traditionally, it was assumed that freedom and determination are mutually exclusive. If action is free, it cannot be determined by causes. If it is determined, it cannot be free. Determinists argued that because all action has causes, freedom is an illusion. Libertarians argue that because freedom is real, there must be actions without antecedent causes. Steiner shows that this dichotomy is false because it confuses different types of determination and causation. When I act based on biological impulses, I don't understand, or social conditioning I haven't examined. I'm determined by forces operating through me, of me unconsciously, and therefore I am not free. Causation is blind and external to understanding. But when I act based on reason that I see through my own intuition and accept as valid after careful examination, I'm determined by reason that I fully understand and consciously endorse. This self-determination through understood reason is precisely what freedom means. Logical necessity in mathematics, or moral necessity in ethics, are not external causes forcing against will, but are ideal contents that consciousness apprehends through free activity of intuition and accepts as guidance for thought and action. I am free, not in spite of, but because I act according to necessity that I see through my own insight, instead of being pushed by blind causes. This synthesis allows Steiner to simultaneously affirm that actions have reasons that justify them, and that we are genuinely free when we act for reasons that consciousness has grasped through our own efforts at understanding. The spiritual dimension of philosophy of freedom that many readers discover only gradually is that Steiner is describing not just philosophical theory, but path of development where cultivation of pure thought becomes spiritual practice that transforms consciousness. When Steiner speaks of intuition of concepts, he is not referring to arbitrary mental constructions, but the direct apprehension of objective spiritual realities that exist in a dimension that transcends the physical world, a realm of Platonic ideas, cosmic logos, domain of eternal forms, ability to think purely without the support of sensory images, to follow abstract reasoning through multiple steps while maintaining clarity, to grasp complex concepts in totality. These capabilities are simultaneously philosophical training and spiritual exercise that develops supersensitive organ of perception. Crucial difference between Steiner and traditional mysticism is that while mysticism seeks spiritual experience through suppression of thought in favor of feeling or will, Steiner's path seeks spiritual experience through intensification of thought until it transcends ordinary limitations and becomes capable of direct perception of spiritual realities. This is specifically modern spirituality appropriate for the era of individual consciousness and scientific thought. It requires neither blind faith nor submission to reason, but invites verification through disciplined exercise of thinking capacities that everyone possesses but normally only partially uses. The influence of predecessors on philosophy of freedom that Steiner openly acknowledges and prefaces reveals both continuities and radical innovations. From Kant, he absorbed rigor of epistemological analysis, but rejected conclusions about the impossibility of knowing thing in itself and the need for morality based on duty. De Fichte emphasized the activity of the self as a foundation, but criticized the idealist tendency to dissolve the object into the product of the subject. From Hegel, he learned dialectics as movement through contradictions, but rejected a closed system where the future was predetermined. From Goethe, he inherited phenomenology that observes essences through careful attention rather than imposing theories. The original synthesis that Steiner created transcends all through a focus on freedom as progressive achievement rather than fixed property, transforming philosophy from theoretical contemplation into practical transformation. The controversial reception of philosophy of freedom when published reflects the difficulty of classifying work that did not fit neatly into established schools. Academic philosophers often ignored it or criticized it as eclectic. Spiritualists were disappointed by the lack of mysticism. Only gradually over the decades was it recognized as a crucial foundation, establishing philosophical basis for anthroposophy. Steiner considered this book his most important contribution, and insisted that serious students should study it carefully because it contains in rigorous form what later works present in descriptive form. The difficulty that many experience with text density is not a defect, but is intentional. Thinking is being stretched beyond its comfort zone, and it is in this effort that development happens. The continued relevance to contemporary issues becomes apparent when we consider how dilemmas from 1894 remain urgent today. In an era of neuroscience claiming to reduce mind to brain, Steiner's analysis of thought as non-reducible activity argues for human autonomy. In an era of relativism denying objective values, the concept of moral intuition offers a foundation between absolutism and nihilism. In an era of behavioral manipulation, insistence on self-determination offers resistance. The message remains radical. Human beings are not determined products, but have the potential for freedom realizable through the development of clear thinking and action based on common sense. Profound moral grasp, transforming life from mechanical reaction into creative expression of individuality, consciously participating in the evolution of the cosmos. The practical application of philosophy of freedom principles in everyday life transforms theoretical questions about the nature of freedom into an existential challenge about how to live progressively freer through the conscious development of specific capabilities. Steiner is not saying that everyone is already free simply because they are human, but that freedom is potential that must be realized through deliberate work of inner transformation over years. This work has multiple dimensions that must be cultivated simultaneously. First is development of the ability to accurately observe both the external world and the internal processes of consciousness, learning to distinguish clearly between raw perception and automatically added conceptual interpretation, between clear thinking and associative fantasy, between genuine feeling and conditioned emotion, between momentary impulse and reflected decision. This precise observation is not trivial because the natural tendency is to confuse different levels of experience and project interpretations onto perceptions without noticing. Second is the cultivation of clear thinking capable of following complex reasoning without losing threads, of maintaining abstract concepts without the support of images, of recognizing fallacies in arguments, of distinguishing what we really know from what we assume. This development is analogous to athletic training, which requires regular exercise, patient repetition, and gradual increase in difficulty. Third is strength of will that can execute conscious decisions, even when impulses or pressures push in the opposite direction. Ability to do what you decide instead of what you feel momentary desire, to maintain long-term commitment against short-term temptations. Fourth is development of moral sensitivity that perceives nuances of complex situations, recognizes multiple conflicting values, anticipates consequences of actions, understands perspectives of others. Fifth is the courage to take full responsibility for choices without excuses of external determination, recognizing that even when circumstances limit options, there is always a choice in how to respond. The relationship between philosophy of freedom and the later development of anthroposophy offers perspective on how Steiner viewed the role of rigorous philosophy as a foundation for investigation of supersensible realities. When he wrote Philosophy of Freedom in the early 1890s, he had not yet explicitly developed methods of clairvoyant perception presented in later works, but he was already practicing meditation, allowing access to dimensions inaccessible to ordinary consciousness. The function of philosophy of freedom within a complete system is to establish an epistemological basis that justifies the possibility of supersensible knowledge through the argument that pure thought, when developed, can transcend limitations of sensory perception and directly apprehend spiritual realities. Without a philosophical foundation, statements about the supersensible constitution of the human being, cosmic evolution, and the nature of Christ would seem like dogmas based on the authority of a seer. With a foundation established showing that thought is a free activity capable of apprehending objective spiritual realities through intuition, anthroposophy becomes a science where observations of supersensible realities are methodologically substantiated and verifiable by anyone who develops necessary capabilities. This is why Steiner insisted that students should study philosophy of freedom first. It provides the conceptual tools and thinking training necessary to understand and critically evaluate later claims. The influence on the anthroposophical movement and practical applications in education, medicine, agriculture, and the arts has been profound, although often implicit. Waldorf schools are founded on recognition of each child as a unique individuality who must be helped to develop capacities for future freedom, rather than molded into conformity. Curriculum develops clear thinking, healthy feeling, and strong will that are foundations of freedom. Anthroposophic medicine treats the patient not as a machine determined by physical processes, but as a free spiritual being who participates in his own healing through the mobilization of forces when appropriate conditions are created. Biodynamic agriculture sees the farm not as a factory, but as an organism that must be treated with respect for its own autonomy. In all of these fields, principles about the nature of freedom as self-determination through understanding operate as regulatory ideas that guide practice even when not cited explicitly. The pedagogical question of how to teach philosophy of freedom is delicate because essential content is not a set of, and doctrines to memorize, but the ability to think freely that must be developed. Steiner cannot simply say, think freely, because following another's instruction on how to think freely is a contradiction. Freedom must be won by one's own efforts. The strategy is to create textual situations where the reader is provoked to think for himself. Arguments are presented as starting points for his own investigation. Distinctions are made with sufficient precision to guide, but not eliminate the need for active work. The same ideas are approached from multiple angles, allowing aspects to become progressively illuminated. The density that frustrates many is not a defect, but is a method. Thought is being stretched, and it is in this effort that development takes place. Studying properly requires multiple readings where each passage reveals previously missed layers, discussion with others, struggling with text, and patience through periods where comprehension seems impossible. The implicit, although not explicitly developed political dimension, points to society organized to maximize possibilities for the development of individual freedom rather than imposing conformity through central authority. Steiner would develop political implications in later works on social trimembration by arguing that a healthy society should separate three spheres: cultural life governed by freedom, legal life by equality, economic life by fraternity, rather than subordinating everything to state control. But already in the philosophy of freedom, there is an implicit critique of systems that treat humans as means for collective ends instead of recognizing them as ends in themselves with the dignity of free agents. Totalitarianisms that completely subject the individual to the state are incompatible with the vision of freedom as the supreme achievement of human nature, but equally problematic would be liberalism that conceives freedom only negatively as the absence of interference, without recognizing the need for the positive development of inner capacities that make real freedom possible. The debate among interpreters over whether philosophy of freedom should be read primarily as an academic philosophy that can be evaluated using standard critical tools, or as a spiritual text that requires inner transformation to be understood, reflects genuine tension in the text itself between the aspiration to make a rigorous contribution to philosophy and the conviction that genuine philosophy must be a path of spiritual transformation. Some scholars argue that we should evaluate arguments by the standards of logic and evidence that philosophy uses, often finding problems when subjected to rigorous scrutiny. Others argue that applying tools of conventional analysis to text that transcends conventional philosophical presuppositions is missing the point. It's like trying to appreciate poetry using only grammar. The truth lies in recognizing that it operates on multiple levels and can be approached in multiple ways. as technical philosophy, offering specific arguments that can be critically evaluated, as descriptive phenomenology, inviting observation of one's own experience, as spiritual text offering a path of development through exercise of thought, as cultural manifesto, advocating values of individuality and creativity against conformity. The international community of readers who have worked on philosophy of freedom over more than a century demonstrates continued vitality. Study groups regularly find themselves working patiently through the text line by line, discovering that discussion reveals multiple interpretations, and that shared struggle creates community of inquiry. Scholars continue to publish analyses exploring relationships with other traditions, examining logical coherence, applying insights to contemporary problems. Practitioners of anthroposophy study it as a philosophical foundation for esoteric teachings. Waldorf educators base pedagogy on principles of developmental freedom. This diversity demonstrates the richness of text that can be approached from multiple perspectives. As academic philosophy, as a spiritual path, as a theoretical foundation for practical applications, as an existential provocation to rethink life. The future of philosophy of freedom. As a living text that continues to inspire thought depends on successive generations willing to make the effort to rethink arguments and apply principles to their own lives. In an era of fragmentation of attention through digital media and declining capabilities for deep reading, the demands that books make, prolonged concentration, rigorous intellectual effort, a willingness to struggle through difficult passages may seem excessive. But precisely because the capabilities it requires are the same ones we seek to develop, working through it despite difficulties is a valuable spiritual exercise that strengthens what that contemporary culture is weakening. The central message remains radically relevant, that human beings are not products of determining forces, but have the potential for genuine freedom realizable through the conscious development of capacities for clear thinking and moral action based on individual intuition, offering an antidote to both the nihilistic despair that sees life as meaningless and the authoritarian conformism that subordinates the individual to the collective, offering instead a vision of human development as a journey toward the progressive realization of freedom through self-effort and cooperation with others who share aspiration. The transformative experience of working deeply with philosophy of freedom over years reveals that it is not merely a book to be read and understood, but a lifelong companion that continues to reveal new depths as one's own development progresses. Readers often report that the first reading was frustrating and confusing. The second began to make sense in parts. The third revealed the architecture of the argument, and subsequent readings continue to illuminate nuances and connections that previous passages missed. This inexhaustibility is not deliberate obscurity, but reflects the fact that Steiner was writing about realities that transcend fixed conceptual formulations, and that can be approached from multiple angles without ever being fully captured in words. The true test of understanding is not the ability to summarize arguments or quote passages, but is observable transformation of life. A person becomes more capable of thinking clearly without being dominated by emotions or prejudices, more capable of observing one's own mental processes objectively, more capable of making conscious decisions and executing them even when difficult, more capable of perceiving moral nuances of complex situations, more willing to take responsibility for choices, without seeking excuses and external determination. Philosophy of freedom offers no easy formulas or guarantees of success, but offers something more valuable: verifiable path to progressive development of genuine freedom through self-effort, dignity of being treated as capable of thinking for oneself rather than needing to accept truths from authority, an inspiring vision of human potential to transcend determination through conscious self-determination that transforms existence from sequence of mechanical reactions into creative expression of unique individuality participating in continuous evolution of cosmos toward realization of potentials that lie dormant in the creative foundation of all existence, and that await awakening through the free effort of individual consciousnesses that freely choose to collaborate with the cosmic purpose of progressive realization of values of truth, beauty, and goodness in ever new forms through creativity that is the hallmark of authentic freedom, operating in harmony with deeper needs of perpetually evolving reality. This work remains a perennial invitation for each generation to discover for itself, through rigorous observation of its own experience of thinking and acting, that freedom is neither a theoretical illusion nor a supernatural gift, but is a practical achievement achievable through the methodical development of capacities that every human being possesses in potential, but that must be awakened and cultivated through patient and disciplined work that transforms consciousness from a passive instrument of determining forces into an active agent of creative self-determination that is simultaneously a unique expression of individuality and conscious participation in the spiritual life of the cosmos that evolves through countless individual consciousnesses working each in their own path, but all towards the same goal of realizing perfect freedom and perfect love that constitutes the final destiny of humanity.